Ow. Good morning, everybody. I was told that there is a ladies' class going on in the building behind us here, so if any of you want to join the ladies' class, please do so now. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and get started here momentarily. Well, Royce is not here? No. This morning we're going to be, for the most part, we're going to be in the second chapter of the book of Ecclesiastes. When Jesse first asked me to take this on, I looked at it and went back to him and said, you know, Jesse, there's 26 verses in that chapter. It's not a lot, and all is vanity. And really, anyway, it's when you do a little bit of study on it, it's quite interesting. And I learned some truths and I learned some non-truths. Maybe my postscript is the biggest non-truth I learned recently was there was a huge article in one of the Palestinian newspapers recently about them finding another tomb of Solomon's ex-wives, and they found documents that described which one of these wives was Solomon's favorite wife, and how she rescued Solomon from being poisoned to death through some wine that actually the wife's father was trying to give to Solomon because he wanted to get rid of Solomon. The great story, you know, was it true? No. Turns out that somebody over there was making a fictional story, and yet it was picked up by the Egyptian Times, by the British Times, and it went all over the world, and people thought that this story was true. So if you see it on Google, who was telling me this morning that Google never lies? Well, yeah, Google sometimes lies too. So anyway, before we get started, let's have a quick word of prayer, and then we'll talk about Mr. Solomon. Our Father in heaven, we come before you this morning graciously, Father, thanking you for all the blessings of life. Thank you for all those who are here this morning, and we pray, Father, that as we study this morning, that we can learn together and that we continue to find ways to achieve a wonderful relationship with you, Father, because that's what we desire. We ask, Father, that you be with those who couldn't be here this morning and that you watch over them and bring them back to us as soon as they possibly can. And thank you, Father, again for blessing us so richly in our lives. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so if you would like to please turn over to Ecclesiastes chapter 2, and we'll talk there for a minute about the true meaning of life. The true meaning of life. Solomon was obviously searching. We can see that throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. He was obviously searching for fulfillment of some kind. Now, Solomon had most everything that I think that if we gathered all of our resources together in this entire church body, we couldn't even come close. And we'll talk about those in a little while, to what Solomon was responsible for in his lifetime. Let's begin in chapter 2, and I'll read the first 2 verses, and we'll talk about that for just a second. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 1 and 2 reads like this. I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with mirth. Therefore, enjoy pleasure. But surely this also was vanity. I said with laughter, madness, and of mirth. What does that accomplish? So We can see here at the beginning of chapter 2 how Solomon, in his mind, is wrestling with different aspects of his life, and what does that really mean? Is all of life concentrated in pleasure? And I think I don't have any flavor for or any feeling for the word mirth. Has anyone ever used that word in your vocabulary? No? I looked it up, and apparently it means more of a thoughtful pleasure, but I can't tell you how true or honest that is. Like I said, that word doesn't mean a whole lot to me, but in any case, he's talking here, obviously part of the verse, about his own pleasure, and he's obviously dissatisfied with just his pursuits in life, and he's looking for something that's going to reward him more as he embarks on this journey through life. Solomon was, if we called it today, he was looking for the good life. He had it, but he was still looking for the good life, and yet he calls these things vain. He calls this stuff vanity. He says in some respects, I think in that verse there, he says, he laughed, ha ha ha, this is madness. That's the way he looked at things. So he was wrestling in his heart about what life is all about. So as we come down to verse 3, he said, so I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine, while guiding my heart with wisdom. I don't know how you satisfy your flesh with wine and guide your heart with wisdom. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but that's what he did. And how to lay hold on folly till I might see what is good for the sons of men to do under heaven all the days of his life. So, mirth, merrymaking, reveling, if you want to call it, drinking, all those things, they obviously were not going to gratify him in any way except in a fleshly way. And Solomon is still seeking for what's the true meaning of life. What's the true meaning of life? So, move on to verse 4 through 6. He says there, I made my works great. We'll talk about those in a few minutes. I built myself houses and planted myself vineyards. I made myself gardens and orchards, and I planted all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself water pools from which to water the growing groves. Yeah, Solomon was very, very active. Now, did Solomon do these things himself? Davis, did he get a shovel and start digging the foundation for a house and put the bricks down? No. He just looked at his people and said, do this. He was a very, very wealthy man. We'll talk about that in a minute too. Solomon had a great passion. He went down to Egypt, if I remember right. He went down to Egypt. In fact, one of his wives came from Egypt, I think, if I'm correct. One of his wives was the Pharaoh's daughter. So he had a great passion, and when he went to Egypt and saw what the Egyptians were doing as far as building structures, he came back to Jerusalem and says, we're going to do this too. So he built the walls, and he built houses, and he built places in the temple, and he just started going crazy with all the building he did. It was just amazing what he accomplished in the short 40 years of his reign. Now, anybody remember when Solomon lived? How long ago was it that Solomon lived? Give me a guess. Yeah. Most scholars will agree on a time span that he reigned from about 968 BC to 928 BC in those 40 years. But that makes it almost, if I do my math right, it makes it almost 3,000 years ago. And yet, when you look at the things that Solomon built over there and had his people build, I find it mind-boggling Absolutely mind-boggling. Let's move on to verse 7 and 8 real quick. He then wasn't satisfied with just building houses. He wasn't satisfied with growing vineyards. He wasn't satisfied with more orchards and more trees, etc. So he goes in another direction and says, I acquired male and female servants. And I had servants born in my house. Yes, I had greater possessions of herds and flocks than all who were in Jerusalem before me. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the special treasures of the kings and of the provinces. I acquired male and female singers, the delights of the songs of men, and musical instruments of all kinds. So there's a lot there in those two verses, but if you would, run over to 1 Kings chapter 8 and verse 63. If you can, turn to 1 Kings chapter 8 and verse 63. I found this to give you a flavor for what Solomon was really talking about here as far as his own wealth. It says there in 1 Kings 8:63, it said, And Solomon offered a sacrifice of peace offerings, which he offered to the Lord, ready? 22,000 bulls and 120,000 sheep. So the king and all the children of Israel dedicated the house of the Lord. Okay. Davis, help me. 22,000 bulls? How big of farmland does he have to hold 22,000 bulls? I can't even fathom that. And I can assume, those of you who know something about farming, I know nothing about farming. Does it not mean if he had 22,000 bulls that he would have at least 22,000 cows? Does that make sense? Or even more cows? Yeah. And how many people did he have taking care of these things? I mean, they just don't stand out there in the middle of the field and wait for the sky to fall. I mean, this is amazing. And 120,000 sheep? I can't even fathom how in the world did he count them? 120,000 sheep? So, very educational from 1 Kings about Solomon. And if you would, move a little bit further in Kings. Where is it here? Yeah, 1 Kings chapter 10. Go 2 chapters further and look starting in verse 14. 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 14. It says there, the weight of gold that came to Solomon yearly was 666 talents of gold. Now, any mathematicians in here? What's a talent of gold? Okay, get out your calculators on your phones. A talent of gold is 75 pounds. Now multiply 75 pounds times 666 talents and tell me what you get. Anybody? 25 tons. Hello? It starts off that the weight of gold that came to Solomon yearly was 25 tons of gold. My brain cannot fathom what that means. You know, you'd be filling this entire building full of gold bars. 25 tons of gold? It's just amazing. Down in that same chapter of 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 16, it says, And King Solomon made 200 large shields of hammered gold. They found one of those, by the way. It stands about this tall and about this wide, about as tall as a man, and about that wide. And his people hammered the gold into shields. Hello? And what does it say? And he also made 300 shields of hammered gold that were 3 minas of gold. So he made another 300 that were about this big by this big. They only weighed about 5 or 6 pounds each. Yeah, so it's something somebody would carry like that. But he did all this work with all this gold every single year. Incomprehensible. Incomprehensible. And then down in verse 18 of the same chapter, 1 Kings 10, it says, moreover, the king made a great throne of ivory and overlaid the ivory with pure gold. The throne had 6 steps. The top of the throne was round in the back. There were armrests on either side of the place, and there were 2 big lions stood beside the armrests, and then 12 lions stood there, one on each side of the 6 steps. And then he says, nothing like this had ever been done in any other kingdom. Well, I guess not. So, does that give you kind of a flavor for, was Solomon wealthy? Was he worried about income taxes? No. I don't know how he possibly had enough people to take care of all these things and to count all these things and to manage all these things. He obviously was a very clever, not just wise, but he was a very clever man to be able to rule over all this stuff. All right, so let's go back now to Ecclesiastes chapter 2, and we're now going to move into verses 9 and 10. And so Solomon says, so I became great, really, and excelled more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. And catch this phrase, all my wisdom remained with me. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure. For my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my reward from all my labor. In verse 11, then I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and on the labor in which I had toiled, and indeed, here it comes, all was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. So here he just tells us about all these things that he had done, all this gold coming to him, all these buildings that he built. The house, by the way, his own personal house that he built in Jerusalem, only took 13 years for them to build that house. 13 years? If I had built my house, my 2 houses that I built, if I had built my house, it took 13 years, my wife would have had a few words to say. But really. But he comes to the conclusion that all is vanity, and he uses the phrase grasping for the wind. So can you picture that in your mind? Yeah? Like there's just nothing there. There's just nothing there. And Solomon was distressing over that. This whole chapter, you can get the feeling that Solomon is saying, look at all I got. Look at all these riches I got. Look at all these buildings I got. Look at all these people I got. Look at all these cattle and sheep and all these things that I have acquired in life. And then he comes slowly down to the conclusion and says, but it's all vanity. It's all vanity. And it's like I'm still grasping for something. I'm grasping for the wind. That's what he says. All righty. And this phrase, if I remember right, this phrase about grasping for the wind and all things under the sun, he uses that phrase about 30 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. So it's a pretty predominant theme throughout Ecclesiastes that he's talking about. He mentions wisdom, but he doesn't really come to any conclusion about wisdom. He says it does help guide his heart, but everything else is vanity. Any comments so far on what we've talked about so far in Solomon? Fascinating guy. He really was a fascinating guy. So Solomon realized that, in part, that wisdom far outweighed all of the other things that he had accomplished or acquired or was in control of in his life. That wisdom was really very, very important. And I mention that because if we go a little bit further in the book of Ecclesiastes, let me see where it was. Okay, if you turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 7 real quick. Couple of key verses in chapter 7. Chapter 7 and verse 11, he says this: "Wisdom is good with an inheritance, and profitable to those who see the sun." So here he's talking about, and I would conjecture that he's talking about, I'm on the earth, I'm under the sun, and wisdom is a good thing. He goes on in verse 12, and he talks about, "For wisdom is a defense, as money is a defense." So he sees wisdom having some value, just like he sees money having some value to be able to get somewhere with that. Wisdom is a defense, as money is a defense. But the excellence of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to those who have it. So now he's kind of coming full circle, and he's starting to think, all right, this wisdom is a good thing, and all these other things are kind of vanity of vanities, etc. If you would look at chapter 7 and verse 19, where he says, "Wisdom strengthens the wise more than 10 rulers of the city." So obviously he sees wisdom as being extremely important in his life and of significant value. In chapter 9, verse 18, he says, "Wisdom is better than any weapons of war, but the sinner," now he's coming to it, "but the sinner destroys much good." And finally, in chapter 10 and verse 10 of Ecclesiastes, it says there, "If the axe is dull and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength. But wisdom brings success." So who here is a tree cutter other than Les? You cut down trees, Les, with an axe? Huh? What would happen if you take that axe and the axe had a really dull blade? How much work would it be to cut down that tree? It'd be awful. Yeah. But if you are smart, you have wisdom, you go and you sharpen that blade real good and get it all nice, and then knock that tree down and nothing flat. Oh, good. So a very practical lesson that Solomon is bringing to us here. The axe is dull and one does not sharpen the edge. He must use more strength. Got to use more resources. And the wisdom brings success. So Solomon is really wrestling with, what's going to happen in his life. And my conjecture is that he's wrestling with what's going to happen with death. And he's coming around to really thinking about it, as to what's going to happen after death, because he says in the other chapters, he says it's kind of foolish. It's kind of foolish of what we go around running and doing, because the same thing happens to the fool that happens to the wise man when he dies. He dies. So what am I working all this time for? I don't know that Solomon hated life. Some of the commentators that I read actually said Solomon hated life. I don't know that he hated life, but obviously he was very stressed. He was very anxious about life, and with all that he had going on, I can't imagine that he wasn't anxious. I mean, he was responsible for an awful lot of stuff there in the city of Jerusalem. Yeah, an awful lot of stuff. So, back in chapter 2 of Ecclesiastes, let's move. Yeah. Let's move on to Ecclesiastes 2:18 through 23, beginning in verse 18. By the way, postscript. If you go back one verse, 17, there he actually says, in Ecclesiastes 2, verse 17, he says, "Therefore, I hated life because the work that was done under the sun," same phrase, "the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me. For all is vanity and grasping for the wind." These are what he's wrestling with. So in verse 18 he says, "Then I hated all my labor in which I had toiled under the sun." Now Solomon, you didn't work real hard, but your people worked pretty hard. "Because I must leave it to the man who will come after me." He switched total gears now. Did you catch what he just did? He says, wait a minute. I've worked all my life, and with my 22,000 bulls and my 120,000 sheep and all my land and my crops and all this stuff, and now I got to turn it over to somebody else when I die? That's not fair. I think that's what he's saying. Hear him. "Then I hated all my labor in which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me." And verse 19, "And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool? Yet he will rule over all my labor in which I toiled and in which I have shown myself wise under the sun." This also is vanity. At the end of verse 19. "Therefore," in verse 20, "I turned my heart and despaired of all the labor in which I had toiled under the sun." Here he's coming to the same conclusion again. "For there is a man whose labor is with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and yet," nana nana boo boo as they say, "and yet he must leave his heritage to a man who has not labored for it. This also is vanity and a great evil." Solomon was not happy when he thought this through about the fact that he had acquired and built and grown up and made all this stuff that he did, and now suddenly he's got to turn it over to, he said, that's just not fair. That's just not right. That's evil. That's just wrong. "This is also vanity and a great evil. For what has a man for all his labor and for all the striving of his heart with which he has toiled under the sun? For all his days," verse 23, "for all his days are sorrowful, and his work is burdensome. Even in the night his heart takes no rest." Again, he says, this also is vanity. This also is vanity. Yeah.
It probably would be a little bit of a different, like he really is frustrated about the idea that I have done so much and acquired so much, and then somebody's just going to get handed to me. So anyway, just probably a little different perspective when you talk about that.
Yeah. Absolutely right. I think that, who was Solomon's father? David. And David had given instructions to Solomon about what Solomon should be doing with his life. And Solomon obviously wanted to please his father. and he accomplished an awful lot of things. But then as he's writing all this, and he's striving for something more fulfilling, he's almost there, and he's going to get there. He's almost there, but it has to be, he's telling us it has to be bigger than something I just can't grasp for the wind. I mean, there's just nothing there. So if you move to chapter 2, verses 20, beginning in verse 24, it says there, "Nothing is better for a man than that he should eat and drink." Really, Solomon? "And that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw," wait a minute, "this also I saw was from the hand of God. For who can eat or who can have enjoyment more than I? For God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight. But to the sinner he gives the work of gathering and collecting, and he may give to him who is good before God. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind." There he's talking about the sinner, not himself. So he's coming now, towards the end of this book, he's coming to the conclusion that, you know what? This is all good if I recognize that it comes from God. If I recognize that God is the one who's giving wisdom and knowledge and all of these things, they're coming from God. That's the only way to make any sense of this. And the poor sinner who's out there gathering and collecting and doing all that, he has no relationship with God, so it's vanity. To him, everything he's doing is vanity. So it's remarkable that Solomon is coming to that conclusion after such a short period of time. The true meaning of life, Solomon, the true meaning of life is that we have a relationship with God, and that everything that we have comes from God. And that relationship can only be found in God. So, one more here. When I first started studying this, I asked one of my preacher friends, no names, wasn't Jesse. I asked one of my friends, could you kindly give me a synopsis of how you see Ecclesiastes chapter 2? I got this. Really? Okay, that's it? But interesting the way that my preacher friend looked at it. He looked at that chapter as being completely opposite from the way that I looked at it. I looked at it as being a chapter that was talking about what am I looking for in my life, and if I don't look to God, it's not going to be there. And he looked at it from completely the opposite. He said, what life isn't about. He said this chapter is all about fun and pleasure and making things in education and accumulating a lot of wealth and working hard and understanding that man sins and stuff like that. And I don't disagree with that, but I think my friend missed the boat here, because in the end, Solomon comes to the conclusion that all these good things only come to me if I have a relationship with my God. It only comes from God. So, the key messages here: everything under the sun that Solomon talks about is just futile. There's futility. He says the word vanity about, I think, 30 to 35 times, depending on which version of the Bible that you read. Vanity, when I looked it up, some people use the word futility. Some people use the word uselessness. Some people use the word nothingness. I don't know how all those relate to vanity. Vanity to me is more of an internal thing that says, ha ha ha, I got it. Yeah, or I don't. The key phrase under the sun, though, is very interesting because he uses this also about 30 times throughout the book. And I really think that he's talking about the fact that he's recognizing that an earthly life is vanity if you don't have a relationship with God. I really think that under the sun, he's talking about, looking up at the sun, I'm on earth, versus looking up into heaven or whatever the case may be. So he's finding an importance to serving God, finally. And that is what's going to give him meaning in life. That is what's going to finally get him to the point where he understands what life is all about, and he's not just grasping in the wind. Now, at the beginning, we didn't talk about this, but at the beginning, there is a phrase, I think it was in chapter 1. I wish Royce was here. Jesse, maybe you can help me. Was it in chapter 1 that it reads something about the preacher, also the son of David, also the king of Jerusalem, wrote this book? Is that in chapter 1? Yeah. Matt's shaking his head. Okay. Tell me, beyond Solomon, who else carried the titles of preacher, son of David, and king of Jerusalem? Who else? It's not a hard question. Jesus. Jesus was the preacher. Jesus was the son of David. Jesus was the king of Jerusalem. I thought it was really interesting that when you look at it, that from Solomon down the road some 1,000 years later, you're going to run right into Jesus. Yeah, going to run right into Jesus. Look at Colossians chapter 2 and verse 3, if somebody could find that. Colossians chapter 2 and verse 3. Because I don't have it here in front of me, but I have the note. Who's got it? Colossians 2 and verse 3. In whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. And who's he talking about there? Christ, yeah. So the preacher, the son of David, the king of Jerusalem, all the treasures that we have come through him, through Jesus. This is what Solomon was coming through at the end of chapter 2. This is God. We're so blessed that we can have a relationship with God, and that is the only thing that makes life worthwhile. Now, postscript. How many wives did Solomon have? You ever see this book? Yeah? Read this book sometime. It's good stuff. You know who Josephus was? Think of him as a Jewish historian. Years after Christ died, he wrote this book. But the detail that he puts into this book, in fact, let me just read you one quick chapter, if I might. Not chapter, one paragraph. He wrote in here, "For as he was asleep that very night, God appeared to him." This is talking about Solomon. God appeared to him and commanded him to ask some gifts, which he was ready to give him as a reward for his piety. So Solomon asked of God what was most excellent and of the greatest worth in itself, what God would bestow with the greatest joy, and what it was most profitable for a man to receive. For he did not desire to have bestowed upon him either gold or silver. I thought that's interesting that Josephus would say that. Or any other riches, as a man and a youth might naturally have. For these are the things that generally are esteemed by most men as alone of greatest worth and the best gifts of God. But said he, Give me, O Lord, a sound mind and a good understanding, whereby I may speak and judge the people according to truth and righteousness. With these petitions, God was well pleased and promised to give Solomon all those things that he had not mentioned in his options: riches, glory, victory over his enemies, and in the first place, understanding and wisdom. And this is such a degree as no other mortal man had. This is from a Jewish historian. Don't know how much of that is factual, but the stories that they brought down over a couple hundred years obviously were told and retold, and Josephus wrote them down. It's interesting how they looked at them. But going back to the question about Solomon's wives, and we'll probably close it there. Solomon had, at best count, 700 wives and 300 concubines. According to my wonderful math brain, I did a little calculation. For the 40 years that Solomon reigned, that meant he could spend no more than 2 weeks with every woman. Over 40 years. All right, Solomon, are you getting all his vanity, Solomon? And start grasping for the wood. Just remarkable, just absolutely remarkable. My sense from my other readings is that much of that had to do with the fact that Solomon wanted Jerusalem to be the kingdom. He wanted Jerusalem to be the place, and therefore he wanted to keep the heritage going, obviously, so he had lots and lots of children. Yeah. A remarkable man, that he would even come to the point where all of this gold and glitter and things that he did. Have you ever seen any pictures of the aquifers and the canals that he built to feed all his crops and stuff outside of Jerusalem? It's remarkable that he put all this stuff together, and then at the end said, "What's it all for? What's it all worth? It's worth nothing, unless I've got a relationship with my God." And that makes me have a lot of respect for Solomon and say, you are smart, Solomon. You let the wisdom finally come through, and good for you that you figured that out before it was too late. So, any questions, comments, criticisms, critiques? And I don't want to handle. Yeah. Well, we always have to remember that in the end, Solomon's still a man. Yeah, he's still a man. And I don't know how he deals with 22,000 bulls and 50,000 pounds of gold every year. That's a tough road to take. But anyway, certainly had a few under his belt. Yeah. So, thank you all for listening, and I hope that gives you a little bit of a flavor for chapter 2. And I don't know who's teaching next week, but come back next week and see what they have to say about chapter 3. Thank you.